So, as you would be aware, if not now, then you will very shortly. Today is in fact the 22nd of April 2015, and it in fact is Earth Day. The picture you see right to my left was taken on Christmas Eve 1968 by William Anders on the Apollo 8 space mission some 47 years ago. Much has changed since that first manned journey around the moon, not least. The world's population was then 3.6 billion. It's now more than twice as large and is projected to be 9.6 billion by 2050. The year 1968 was arguably the year hope died for many who wanted a better world. It could be described as the year of the perfect storm. Robert, also known as Bobby Kennedy, Democratic presidential candidate and brother of President John F. Kennedy, and also the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. were both assassinated in that critical year. These two assassinations and the ending of the Prague Spring by Soviet tanks, the Paris student riots, a worsening conflict in Nigeria with the Biafran War, and a low point in the Chinese Cultural Revolution all happened in 1968. Such events changed the zeitgeist of the time. This, I would contend, is why the picture of a small Earth alone in space captured the imagination of all who saw it then and all who see it today. It unites us all. It is, therefore, fitting to recall Bobby Kennedy, who said the following: "There are those who look at things the way they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask why not." I personally am inspired by this message of hope. It's not a question of whether the glass is half empty or half full, but what are we going to do about it? Instead of simply looking at the glass, we can play our part and actually fill it. In his Nobel acceptance speech to the Swedish Academy, the writer John Steinbeck and the author of The Grapes of Wrath stated, "Man himself has become the greatest challenge and our only hope. We can no longer afford to be spectators to what is happening in the world today. We need to become actors that play an active role in what happens on the global stage." Despite the chaos of 1968, in the years since, the world successfully overcame a pending global food crisis, despite the fact that the human population was then growing at close to its fastest rate ever. Yet given this formidable challenge, global food supplies tripled and world per capita incomes in real terms more than doubled. Few people back in 1968 would have believed that such successes were possible when the world then faced a Cold War that was at its height and when the risks of nuclear conflict seemed so near. The very positive changes witnessed over the past 50 years or so did not just happen by accident. They were caused by the deliberative actions of individuals in both the private and the public sector. Investments were made in high-yielding crop varieties. Knowledge was created and diffused. And gradually people were given opportunities in terms of better education, healthcare, and employment. It's worth considering these human triumphs when thinking about what we must do in the next 35 years as we face the human-created challenge of climate change, the need to produce at least 60% more food, and how we can respond to projected increased water demand of at least 50% and primary energy demand of 40% by 2050, but without damaging the soils and the resources we need to feed the world. I contend that our past successes made many of us complacent in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. Seemingly, somehow, it was thought that business as usual would continue to deliver the food and the environmental services that we all need now and forever. The rude awakening came exactly 40 years later. In 2008 and 2009, the world experienced its worst economic recession in 70 years, with the global financial crisis, also known as the Great Recession. It showed that very large and unexpected shocks can happen almost out of the blue and be enormously damaging. Equally as important, it showed that driving our planet on cruise control is simply not good enough, and that past ways of decision-making and understanding of risks had spectacularly failed. Immediately before the global economic crisis, the world had experienced its own food crisis in terms of food prices. Average food prices rose some 80% on average from 2005 to 2008, primarily as a result of high energy prices, but also, in part, due to misguided policies to subsidize biofuels production. Indeed, in the absence of biofuels production, the global food price in 2008 would have been approximately 23% lower than it was actually. The end result of both higher energy prices and biofuel subsidies was that globally an additional 100 million people or so became chronically undernourished. These food price increases and another price spike in wheat in 2010 and 11 were contributing factors to the Arab Spring that got underway about that time. Just as in the French Revolution 220 years previously, very high food prices generate their own political and socio-economic risks. The food price spikes of 2008 and 2011 show that systemic risks between food and energy. Recent droughts, such as Australia's own millennium drought that ended in 2010, and the California drought, which is 4 years in the making and is still ongoing in 2015, illustrate our critical dependence on water for food production and environmental services. 1968 was the year that the phrase the Green Revolution was popularized in reference to the ability of high-yielding varieties, coupled with greater inputs, to transform food production. One of the fathers, if not the father of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, who did pioneering work in plant breeding on high-yielding wheat varieties, was awarded the Nobel Prize for his contribution to world peace as a result of his efforts to increase global food supplies. Unlike 1968, in 2015, we are approaching, or perhaps have surpassed, key planetary boundaries or limits. Simply put, it is not physically possible to increase food supplies at the expense of extracting water at an increasing rate or irreparable soil degradation in many of the key food-growing regions of the world. Instead, we need an alternative vision that has been called sustainable intensification. I interpret sustainable intensification as increasing food production, which we most certainly need, but without using more arable land or inputs, such as water, that would otherwise degrade our long-term ability to produce food or irreparably damage critical environmental systems. Full consideration of the systemic risks across food, energy, and water, and the collective impacts on the environment are achievable. It is no pipe dream, but it will not happen by simply wishing it, by moral exhortations that we become vegans, or by resting on past laurels. Too often we wring our hands, take amazing pictures to illustrate our despair, make documentaries, swarm together on social media, and care loudly and publicly. We have telegraphed the problem to the world. Now we must fix it, and we know how. The global food and energy and water risks of today demand nothing less than a paradigm shift in how we see the world and how we make decisions. Silo thinking, which has delivered in the past, is simply not good enough in a highly connected world, where a drought in China can trigger a revolution in Egypt, or when the banning of rice exports in one country can temporarily push millions in other places to become malnourished. There is a better way. It's not tears for fears, nor is it more hand-wringing or even food aid, however well-meaning that may be. What is required are ways to help decision makers make better decisions, whether it be a farmer, a catchment manager, or even a president. My colleagues and I in the Food, Energy, Environment and Water Network, FE2W, have developed a Risk and Opportunities Assessment for Decision-Making, ROAD, framework, which can be applied at different scales and scope, and is intended to improve decision-making by accounting for systemic risks. It is not an optimization framework, but instead provides ways of assessing risks that explicitly incorporates the decisions needed to be made by individuals, businesses, and governments. Our approach includes 1. A delineation of the decision space and questions, a big challenge in itself. 2. An evaluation of threats and their triggers. 3. Causal risk and opportunities assessment. 4. An analysis of decision options for controls and ways to mitigate consequences, including a summary and justification of the selected decisions. And 5. An update and review following the decisions and their implementation. The time and effort to apply our framework will depend on the temporal and geographical scale of the decisions at hand. For a subsistence farmer, it may be a simple and virtually costless process, but one that would provide a more systematic way to assess and mitigate risks. By contrast, for a state water manager or department responding to food and water risks along the Ganga, it would be much more involved, considering multiple triggers and threats and risks and a range of decision controls and options. Whatever the scale or challenge, the value add of the risk and opportunities assessment for decision making, and that's a bit of a mouthful, is to provide a way for decision makers to make causal, risk-based decisions. This is urgently needed in the food, energy, environment, and water space. Please work with us, the FE2W network, and others, and partner with us, and also decision makers working at different scales in key parts of the world. The Volta Basin and the Nile Basin in Africa, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna in South Asia, the Mekong in Southeast Asia, the Colorado in the United States and Mexico, and the Murray-Darling Basin here in Australia. Our efforts to navigate the perfect storm needs the support of ambassadors, high commissioners, donors, thinkers, and doers. Collectively, we need and we must build durable partnerships and the means to scale up the risk and opportunities assessment for decision framework to generate improved outcomes on the ground and around the world. This is a collective effort. It requires that we manage and we mitigate the systemic risks across food, energy, the environment, and water so that we can promote a sustainable and prosperous future for all of humanity. To me, there's no question that the world faces major challenges over the coming decades in the context of food, energy, environment, and water. But just as in 1968, when it all seems too hard, and when many believed that the world was heading towards mass starvation, we collectively turned the ship around in very stormy waters. The time for Brothers Grimm fables are over. The time for actions is at hand. Many, many opportunities exist, and better decision-making can deliver solutions to the challenges that we face. We know what to do and where to start to work. Humanity proved the food doom-mongers wrong in 1968. This was done by using more land, a lot more inputs, especially fertilizers and water, by improving technologies, and with a single-minded focus on production. In the next 35 years, we must act differently. Increasing food supplies at the expense of irreversible soil loss or the mining of key aquifers or much greater greenhouse gas emissions is no longer sustainable, if it ever was. Now an alternative path is required. This pathway to the future demands better decisions that connects the dots across food, energy, environment, and water. It requires decisions that fully account for the value chains from the farm gate to the dinner plate. It needs integrated assessment and management to promote resilient food, energy, water systems that can withstand unexpected and negative shocks, and decisions that do not compromise future sustainability. Better risk-based decisions are needed if we are to navigate the perfect storm that lies ahead of us to 2050 and beyond. This is not a journey we can take by ourselves. We must work together. We can contribute, we can continue to feed and clothe the world to 2050 and beyond, but not in ways that compromise our common future. Instead, we must act to ensure our food and natural systems are resilient to shocks, and above all, that we are responsive to the opportunities of the unexpected. Thank you.